Imagine a village consumed by a witch hunt.
The things that the people of Salem endured in 1692 were totally horrific. If you live in a society that believes in witchcraft, that believes that witchcraft and bewitchment are real, then it is.
Imagine the terror of knowing the sentence for witchcraft is death.
I'm not a witch. I'm innocent.
A whole community who are educated and thoughtful, believe themselves to be doing the absolute right thing.
We offer this witch for your judgment.
People who were not fundamentally bad thought that this was their duty.
I'm not a witch. No, no.
That makes it all the more horrific.
And keep us, your humble servants, the devil from our midst.
The witch hunt is on. It's a brutally cold night in January. Abigail Williams and Betty Paris are trying to find imaginative ways to pass the time. As it gets later, they decide to try to predict their futures with something called a Venus class.
They were trying to see who would be their future husbands, who they might marry someday.
Though they know that any kind of fortune-telling is off limits, the two young girls can't resist consulting the cup to see if the shape of the egg white will reveal important clues about their future husbands.
What can you see?
Supposedly, the egg white coalesced in the bottom of the glass in the shape of a coffin.
Does that mean the man you marry will die?
The girls are horrified by the disturbing results.
In an environment where they had been taught that dabbling in any kind of magic, any kind of occult activities, no matter how seemingly harmless, were really a way of allowing the devil to enter into your soul, they would have been terrified by this.
You've done something forbidden, and then something weird happened, and so you really feel like, what have I dabbled in? What door have I opened?
They have heard stories of demonic possession, but now Abigail and Betty are terrified. Have they just sold their souls to the devil?
So here we are in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692.
Salem in 1692 is actually two different places. Salem Town, which is on the water, which is a port city, and Salem Village, which is modern-day Danvers. Salem Village was more remote, it was more outlying. You know, they're surrounded on all sides by wilderness. A wilderness that is already peopled, and peopled by people who the Puritans would have considered to be devilish.
It was practically in a war zone. There had been places not that far off that had been attacked by Native Americans.
The Puritans in Salem Village thought of Native Americans as agents of the devil.
So there is a sort of existential dread attached to living on a frontier that is at the edge of that which is unknown.
Many people came there with the idea of creating a perfect community.
They saw themselves as a New Jerusalem, as bringing the Word of God into the wilderness, into a land that they thought was really the dominion of the devil.
The Puritans were hoping to build an ideal utopian community, a city on the hill. This was to be a new Eden.
You might not think it today, but more than 300 years ago, this was a bustling port Families would take ship here for the new world, a new life, a chance to escape religious persecution. They took with them alongside these high hopes, like a microbe born on a summer's breeze, stories of witchcraft and a belief in the devil.
The primary book in every Puritan home, and very often the only book, was the Bible. What we find in the Bible as literal truth for the Puritans are a belief in witches and also a belief in the ending of days, the apocalypse, the second coming.
Life was very hard work. There was very little fun. And for young girls especially, it was tough. It sounds odd to say that it was also incredibly stressed, but it was, because there were a lot of things to be fearful of. In January 1692, there was actually an attack in York, which was in fact about 55 miles away, where it ended in a massacre of all the white inhabitants. And in Salem Village, they knew it could happen to them. The houses were all a long way apart from each other, because everybody lived on a house, on a farm, about a mile from the next neighbor, so that if you were attacked, you couldn't even get help from anywhere else.
The landscape would have looked a lot different than it does today. It would have been very heavily forested. It would have been very dark, not a lot of development, a lot of woods. And both in English folklore and then sort of bringing that over into the New World, there's a lot of fear of the darkness, fear of the woods. And then because the Puritans also believed themselves to be God's chosen people in New England, they thought that the devil would be especially interested in what they were doing.
The Puritans are convinced of their religious righteousness. All who disagree with them are damned. It has a lot of connections to a cult-like community.
Sunday was the day of rest after a very hard-working week, and the rest consisted of 8 hours of going to meeting.
I must warn you all of the devil's hostility towards this church.
They were divided up, men on one side, women on the other, and the children and servants and slaves slightly set back. It would have been very, very cold. It was completely unheated. But they were expected to behave themselves in church. They were expected to listen to the sermon.
To ensure people paid attention, a member of the congregation known as the tithing man would poke people with a stick. And presiding over the service was Salem Village's minister, Samuel Paris.
And grant that
who the minister was of paramount importance. And they'd had a series of ministers who hadn't gone over particularly well with the congregation at Salem Village. And in 1689, the newest minister, Samuel Paris, arrived.
And it is imperative that we keep our town.
He was not initially called to the church. He had a sort of mixed and varied career, including running a plantation into the ground in Barbados, coming to Boston and making a hash of being a businessman, and then coming to Salem Village, where he immediately made himself disagreeable with the villagers.
And I remind you all, only through grace can one enter God's kingdom.
There was a faction in Salem Village, particularly the Putnams, who really liked Samuel Paris, who thought he was the right man for the job. Other important people in Salem Village didn't see him as a uniter of the town, but rather someone who would divide.
There is sinfulness everywhere in this village.
Samuel Paris lives in the church's 2-bedroom residence, which he shares with his wife Elizabeth and the 2 girls who had dabbled in fortune-telling, his niece and maid Abigail Williams and his daughter Betty.
After 8 hours of listening to sermonizing, then it was time to go home and read the Bible together as a family. So it was a really full day.
Christ sits at God's right hand and intercedes for sinful humanity.
Samuel Paris's household would not have been one of a lot of light and a lot of joy. They would have spent hours poring over scripture by the fireside. You can imagine these girls listening to Samuel Parris practice his hellfire and brimstone sermons.
That's for you.
There was a lot of emphasis on the idea that women in particular were susceptible to the wiles of Satan.
For the Lord, your God, he it is. 50th for you. Daddy? What's the matter? See you through it, will you?
Paris asks his enslaved servant Tituba to help Betty.
Betty began exhibiting strange symptoms.
The first symptoms were of crawling under chairs and talking in a disconnected way, and nobody being able to figure out why.
I met with the village committee today about not receiving my firewood.
I think Betty Parris and Abigail Williams were undoubtedly aware of the social tensions that were swirling in Salem at the time. One can imagine the conversations around the dinner table that may have fed into their fears that were manifested in their own affliction.
What terrible sickness has been unleashed in the minister's household?
Once Samuel Parris's daughter Betty began to exhibit the symptoms of these violent fits, it soon spread to another member of the Parris household, Abigail Williams.
Betty? I think the attention that the girls were able to receive and channel was probably intoxicating.
The town's minister, Samuel Parris, is desperate to understand the cause of their illness.
Parris called upon William Griggs, the local physician, to come and try to diagnose whether there was an underlying physical cause.
Does that hurt at all?
Unsurprisingly, the doctor can't find anything physically wrong with Betty or with Abigail.
Instead of diagnosing a physical cause, the doctor suggests something far more disturbing.
I'm sorry, but I think she's under the influence of an evil hand.
Meaning that he suspected bewitchment. Samuel Parris's initial reaction was to be patient in the face of God's punishments and in the face of adversity, and rather to pray for guidance. The belief in witchcraft were sanctioned by the greatest minds of the age. Educated scholars from Cambridge and Harvard and the greatest universities taught that witchcraft was real.
When his daughter and servant Abigail fell ill, Samuel Parris would have rightly looked at himself and wondered if this was some kind of mark against the state of his own soul.
In the early modern period, religion, magic, and science were mixed. They didn't have these firm separations as we do today. The Salem witch trials take place during the period of the scientific revolution, so people are trying to work out what is natural, what is supernatural, or what is what they call this middle category of the preternatural.
There's a lot of thinking going on about invisible forces. One kind of thinking are people like Isaac Newton, who are now being able to map invisible forces with mathematics, with science. At the very same time, there is this sense of other invisible forces, alchemical forces, divine forces, fluxes that people are trying to understand. And in a certain way, Salem's right there in the middle of it.
Because they believed in such a very active invisible world, their explanations sound today to us to be superstitious maybe, or unrealistic, but everyone in that time period believed that magic was real and that there was an invisible world that influenced your daily life.
The girl's conditions are getting worse. The fit's more extreme.
Around this time, Samuel Parris is visited by a local landowner, Thomas Putnam, who brings with him his daughter Anne Jr. and servant Mercy Lewis. Parris reveals the terrifying nightmare that his family is enduring.
Samuel Parris and his wife tried all the herbal remedies they knew about, but nothing made any difference.
The community knows that it's in your house.
Nothing happened by coincidence. If your child was having fits or was ill, you sought the reason for that, and that reason was rooted in relationships within the community. Who is it that wishes me and my family harm and is the sort of person who would turn to the devil?
Excuse me.
In the midst of all of this uncertainty and anxiety, a local beggar woman, Sarah Good, shows up begging for food.
I'm very, very sorry to have knocked on your door, but I find myself in a very difficult time with no food or clothing for my daughter.
You haven't been seen in church in many months.
She says she hasn't gone for want of clothes. What that means is not, I didn't have something cute to wear. It means that she's in rags.
I cannot pay for them.
So she is supported by depending on the kindness of her neighbors, which, of course, in this time period, most people don't have much extra to go around.
She went away muttering under her breath. For the people of Salem who believed in witchcraft, they would have seen this as potentially a curse that she was muttering. In the aftermath of her visit, the violent fits they're going through intensify and worsen.
My head! It hurts!
Initially, Samuel Parris tried to keep the incidents that were going on in his home quiet. But rumors eventually spread through the tight-knit community.
Salem Village had about 600 inhabitants. Close quarters. Everyone is seeing each other at the tavern, at the church meeting house, in the shops, in the streets. So when Abigail and Betty start to manifest their symptoms of affliction, the word travels very, very quickly.
In my opinion, we have to find out who's hurting the children.
Mary Sibley, in an attempt to help, approached Tituba, the enslaved woman that Parris had brought from Barbados when he came to Salem Village.
Mary Sibley suggests using a type of folk magic she believes will protect the children from witchcraft.
Despite the fact that she was a devout woman and a Puritan, she was also someone who dabbled in these kind of occult activities. This was quite common. People in England often practiced these kind of folk magic, things like forms of divination, healing spells and charms. And all of these kind of folk beliefs came to the New World with these colonists and rooted themselves in these Puritan communities.
There's a very fine line between what is folk magic and harmful magic, the kind of harmful magic that comes directly from the devil. This is at the crux of the problem of the young women in Salem. Witches come in at the fireplaces, they come over the threshold. So counter magic is particularly effective, rather like a modern alarm system in the 17th century home, and even as here in the 17th century castle.
The witch bottle was a powerful form of counter magic. You'd fill it with nails, with urine, with samples of cloth, hair or nail clippings from the afflicted person, and heat it under the fire. As the fluids boiled and the nails grew hot, the witch would suffer. Her magic would be turned against her. So here at the heart of the castle, we've got a witch mark. The idea being that no witch could pass by this mark unscathed.
Even to this day, when homes in Essex are renovated and old walls knocked through, it's often possible to find witch marks or domestic animals hold up as an effective counter-magic against witchcraft or pestilence.
Here we have a pretty grisly item, the remains of a desiccated cat walled into one of the houses of Essex as an effective piece of counter-magic.
A poppet in the 17th century is simply a doll. But once you take that doll, begin to braid into its own hair a lock from someone else's hair, and then stick it with pins, it can be an instrument of devilish magic.
This image is far less to do with folk belief than to do with a belief in witchcraft. You've got the devil handing out poppets or wax images to a coven of witches while demonic spirits spin around overhead.
Witchcraft in Salem was deeply influenced by English ideas about witchcraft that had crossed the Atlantic with the settlers. Very often, witchcraft came in the form of a sickening child, of butter that wouldn't churn, or of households being afflicted by disease. If you think about it, we still practice folk magic in the home today. How often, when somebody spills salt on the dinner table, they flick over their shoulder a few granules as a way to ward off ill luck. This is simply what was being done 200, 300, 400 years ago to protect the home from bad luck.
Folk magic practices were a common way to try and protect yourself from the evils of witchcraft. But there was always a question as to what would be considered acceptable and what would be seen as demonic. Because of this, Tituba waits until the Parishes are out of sight before attempting the remedy recommended by Mary Sibley, a form of counter-magic known as a witch cake.
What are you doing?
I'm making a very special cake that's going to make the both of you feel better.
A witch cake was a traditional English remedy for witchcraft.
To make a witch cake, you take some rye meal, you collect urine from the afflicted girls, mix it together into like a paste, bake it into a biscuit, and then feed the biscuit to the dog.
Once we bake this, it will tell us everything that we need to know.
There are two ways that they thought that this might free the girls from bewitchment. One thought was that perhaps it would cause the bewitchment to travel out of the bodies of the girls and into the body of the dog. Another way it might work was it was believed that the act of bewitching someone created a kind of correspondence relationship between the witcher and the witchy. So the munching up of the cake by the dog would cause the witch's body to feel munched up, and she would then release the children.
Let's bake this.
What have you done? You brought this into my
When
home!
Paris found out about it, he went incandescent.
He is incensed.
Who else knows about this? Who?
He even intimates that this act was skating right up to the line of the crime of witchcraft.
You know what you've done? You brought the devil upon my home!
He called this going to the devil for help against the devil.
Get in there!
Accounts from the time say that he even savagely beat Tituba.
Tituba's attempt to help the girls will have severe and tragic consequences.
When the girls first started to perform their afflictions, they didn't name anyone.
That will suddenly change when the girls begin to have visions of the dark forces attacking them.
The girls begin to see specters.
These specters are ghostly versions of the witch who can attack their victim from afar.
Betty.
Paris kept asking, who is it that afflicts you?
Who hurt you?
Tituba hurt us.
They named Tituba, the woman who had been a part of their lives really since they can remember.
Why have the girls turned on Tituba? And what will happen to the devoted servant now?
Samuel Paris calls to his household a number of preeminent thinkers in Salem Village and also some from the surrounding areas.
Of course, I'm not only concerned for the girls' welfare, but for my own.
Among the experts that Paris calls in are Magistrate John Haythorne, fellow Minister Nicholas Noyes, and Thomas Putnam.
I could quickly find myself out of the parsonage if it was known that Satan has moved in.
Samuel's concerns are valid, as I share them myself.
Paris still clings to the hope that there might be some natural cause for the girl's condition.
What remedies have been tried?
For 2 months, we've tried one home remedy after another.
People often assume that the Puritans automatically jumped to the devil being behind everything. But that's not the case. They actually were interested in seeing if there were natural causes behind the affliction symptoms of the young girls. But the men who came and observed Abigail and Betty pretty quickly came to the conclusion that they were being bewitched.
Do we know what might have given rise to their condition?
When Paris reveals that the girls have named Tituba as the source of their ailments, the men decide to question her.
Tituba's ethnicity almost certainly was Carib Indian. She looked different from the English colonists that she was forced to live among.
And even stranger,
although she was a family intimate, the fact of her difference was something that was never forgotten.
They seem to know Tituba's whereabouts and what she does, even when she is nowhere in their sight.
As an enslaved woman, Tituba is in an extremely precarious position. Her response seems to be to try to placate people who are asking her questions.
Your master tells us that you have been practicing magic.
Tituba claims that her mistress on Barbados had actually been a witch and had actually taught her the test.
She taught you what?
What comes out very much about Tituba is that she was always trying to please.
Well, the obvious thought that arises here is that if Tituba was a witch herself, which is supposedly what the test yields, why would she accurately perform the test whose only goal is to expose her as a witch? Because if this test is to work, and if she is the one administering it, and if administering it will indict her, why would she do it?
Tituba's attempt to cooperate only leads to more trouble.
What begins as folk magic with totally benevolent purposes can very quickly become seen as witchcraft.
My advice is patience, regular fasting, and prayer.
Rather than follow this advice, Paris decides to take matters into his own hands.
Why are you doing this? Tell me.
Convinced that all of the family's problems can be solved if Tituba admits to being a witch, Paris tries to beat the confession from her. But Tituba stands firm.
Tell me!
Then, without warning, the terror begins to spread throughout Salem Village. Several other young girls start to show signs of attack by witchcraft.
Anne, what's wrong?
First, Ann Putnam, Jr., the daughter of Thomas Putnam. Also in the Putnam household is 19-year-old Mercy Lewis. Mercy Lewis was a survivor from the Maine frontier. She had been orphaned at a young age, and she'd seen a lot of traumatic events, and these kind of fears and anxieties and traumas could have played a role in the fits that she was experiencing.
Less than a mile away, Mary Walcott also begins to writhe, choke, and babble.
There is, particularly among these young girls in Salem, a real susceptibility to these ideas. And so this spreads like wildfire. When they hear that these things have happened to the two girls in the house of the minister, then why would they not think that witches could come and afflict them?
It's not mutually exclusive that these girls could both believe deeply that they had been bewitched and that they reveled in the newfound power that this gave them.
Meanwhile, the girls in the parsonage continue to be attacked by Tituba's specter.
They were just contorted in extraordinary postures that looked as though they must be incredibly painful.
Leave them alone.
Paris asks Abigail if there is anyone else she can see besides Tituba.
Two women.
Who is it?
She furnishes two names, which are really pivotal.
Sarah Good.
Who else?
Sarah Osborne.
Both of these women are straight out of central casting for witchcraft.
The two women named by the girls fit the stereotypical image of a witch.
Sarah Good has been accused of being a witch before. She has an intensely quarrelsome reputation. Sarah Osborne, as well, is known to have a slippery tongue.
Now that the girls have named their tormentors, 4 village leaders led by Thomas Putnam decide to take action.
Thomas Putnam, along with several of his associates, lodged formal complaints against Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne.
The women will all be arrested, setting in motion a wave of panic that will shake Salem to its core. Salem Village is in uproar. Everyone is desperate to see Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne paraded through town in shackles as they are led to their fate.
An examination had to take place to see whether or not these initially accused witches had enough evidence against them to warrant a grand jury trial.
Witchcraft is a recognized crime, and the penalty is death by hanging.
In a typical witch trial, any sort of examination would have been a small and private affair. Salem already is different in that regard. Word has been spreading for weeks about the mysterious afflictions of the little girls. People have heard rumors about this. Rumors travel quickly then, as they do now. So people came from pretty far away.
People come from as far as Boston to see the examinations. They take on a circus-like atmosphere. This helps really feed the sense of anxiety and chaos within the village at that time, but it also feeds the rumor mill.
I think that's important to understand the public spectacle because it helps us to understand why the community of otherwise intensely intelligent, intensely devoted, caring, good people came to believe something that we now regard as so fantastical and beyond belief.
The plan is to hold the examinations in the Salem Village Tavern.
It was quite a to-do getting them there, not so much Tituba. I think she went quietly. But Sarah Good kept hitting out at people. She was a very aggressive personality. Sarah Osborne, I think, just wasn't very well.
But when they arrive at the tavern, it becomes clear that there are far too many people to fit everyone inside.
To the meeting house!
So they move to the largest building they have, the meeting house where the Puritans would have held their worship services.
The two people presiding over these early examinations are John Corwin and John Hawthorne, and they're not lawyers. They are merchants with an interest in the law.
Bring forward Sarah Good, please.
The room is jam-packed, filled to capacity. You have the frightened suspects. You have scores of their neighbors and relations, along with the afflicted girls.
The afflicted girls were present. And this is kind of crucial because the attention that's being brought changes the way the afflicted girls behave.
Are we ready?
Sarah Good has been accused of being a witch before. She has an intensely quarrelsome reputation. She's not a well-respected member of the community.
Haythorne, not an experienced jurist, seeks to trap these suspects through leading questions.
Sarah Good. What spirits are you familiar with?
None of this, assuming somebody's innocent till they're proved guilty nonsense. He knows she's guilty. In his own mind, there's no question.
When did you first covenant with the devil?
I have never.
Do you not have a contract with the devil?
Finally, after several failed attempts to get a confession, Haythorne turns to the afflicted girls.
Is this the woman that hurts you? Look at her.
The girls' reaction is shocking.
They're clearly manifesting their pain and torture to the audience.
They probably were legitimately afraid of the women that they were accusing of witchcraft. You would expect that the witch would turn all of her power against you, against the accuser.
The behavior of the afflicted girls is seen not just by the magistrates doing the examinations, but also by the townsfolk as strongly suggestive of guilt.
Sarah Good, do you not see now what you have done? Why do you not tell us the truth? Why?
Desperate to save herself, Sarah Good points the finger at the two other suspects.
You should have brought other people to this meeting house with me.
And he said, what others?
Osborne.
It's now a fight for survival, but who will ultimately take the fall? Attention at the examinations now turns to Sarah Osborne.
Sarah Osborne was a bit of an outcast in the village. She'd done something very scandalous in her past.
Sarah Osborne hasn't been seen at meeting for some time. One school of thought holds that it's because she has taken up with a man who worked for her. So there is a sexual dimension to Sarah Osborne's alienation from the religious community.
Psychologically speaking, there's this effect called the devil effect. And the devil effect suggests that people who look bad are bad. We immediately assess the trustworthiness of people based on how they look. According to research, we actually make a decision as to whether we should trust someone within a tenth of a second. Do I trust this person or should I fear this person? And this probably has an evolutionary origin, where especially when we were tribal, as soon as someone was perceived as the other, perceived as a threat, it would trigger our fight or flight response. The downside of this is that it also leads to us trusting our gut way too much in situations where it's not warranted, something we need to constantly override. The phenomenon of creepiness has actually only recently been studied directly. And so the question is, what makes somebody creepy? And if we relate it to witches and our stereotypical also depictions of witches, it actually matches surprisingly closely. People said things like long fingers were creepy, that greasy hair was creepy, things like looking different or wearing abnormal clothing. Again, something we associate with witches.
Sarah Osborne.
Already convinced of Sarah Osborne's guilt, Haythorne immediately tries to get her to make a damning confession.
What evil spirits are you familiar with?
None.
In her attempt to clear her name, she testified that she was more likely to be bewitched than to be a witch. And she told a story about an apparition that she had seen.
I saw a dark specter.
But she slipped up and told the magistrates that this diabolical figure had warned her not to go to meeting, not to attend church. And in fact, she had not attended church for a year and a half at that time.
So you admit you confer with the devil himself?
Because of illness, but it appeared more sinister before the court.
Like Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne denies having any involvement in witchcraft. Finally, amid great anticipation, Tituba is called forward for the last interrogation.
Straight away, the girls just all started screaming and shouting.
Why do you hurt these children? What harm have they done to you?
I do no harm to them.
She starts out by denying that she is a witch.
I have done nothing.
And she sees that is not going well.
Does the devil tell you he hurts them?
And then her testimony shifts.
Tell me the truth. Who hurts them?
The devil, for all I know.
She reads the situation.
Ah.
She shifts immediately from being combative to being acquiescent. And she gives the court what the court seems to want.
I think she's incredibly savvy in certain ways. She realizes that if she confesses, she might make it out alive.
Haythorne, instead of being harsh and angry and pressing, he was delighted with her. I mean, this was what he wanted to hear.
And how does the devil appear?
I think yesterday I saw a thing like a man, all in black.
When Tituba says she sees the devil, she doesn't say she sees a grotesque winged beast. She says she sees a man.
Tituba describes him as a man in a black hat. Some historians have pointed to the fact that she describes a man who dresses like Samuel Paris.
The crowd is stunned into silence as Tituba begins her story.
He appeared as I was scrubbing the floor.
Serve me.
He told me he was a god, and he asked me to serve him.
Believe in me. Serve me for 6 years, and I will give you many fine things.
He said he was going to hurt the children, and he wanted my help.
Refuse, and I will hurt both you and the children. See? For you.
You're no god. This is a matter for my master. When I refused, he disappeared.
You will see me again.
A few days later, he came back with good wife good.
Spirit from upon this house, we ask that you heal these children.
He offered me a little yellow bird.
Tituba describes the yellow bird flying above the family's praying heads, seen only by her and the children whose eyes had been opened to the invisible world.
We ask that the spirit from above us. Lord, we ask that you give the souls in this house.
She describes being offered money and being offered rest from work for a woman who is not free. In some sense, I see Tituba's confession as a very profound expression of a wish for all of the power that she is denied.
For all the pain and suffering that it has brought into my life.
Then, on another bird, I saw the face of Goodwife Osborne.
Sign the book and be free.
In the fireplace, I saw a creature all over Harry, like an imp.
The devil asks Tituba if she would like the imp as her servant.
No. No, I would not.
Serve me.
She says that the devil sought to make her sign her soul in his book.
It's a very Protestant vision that there would be a book involved, because of course Puritans are people of the book. It's an especial perversion for an enslaved woman to pick up a pen and make her mark or write her name.
Good signs. Osborne signs. Whose signs?
He then offered me the book again and made me sign it. But in it written I saw were 9 other names.
It's a shocking revelation that suggests there are 9 other witches in Salem. The courtroom is stunned.
So now the hunt is on.
As Tituba's interrogation concludes, once again, the afflicted children burst into fits.
Who now afflicts these children?
Sarah Good.
Who else?
Sensing her options closing in, Tituba claims she too is afflicted.
I cannot see. I am blinded.
Moments later, Tituba is rendered speechless, forcing John Haythorne to end the examination. Since witchcraft is a hanging offense, the 3 suspects are transferred to Boston Jail to await their formal trial. Unwilling to accept her fate, Sarah Good attempts to escape. It does her no good.
Tituba's confession confirms the suspicion that witchcraft is responsible for what's happening in the village. Now, for Samuel Parris, what a relief. You know, it's not that there's something wrong with his soul. It's not that there's something wrong with his leadership. The problem lies outside of him.
This was the confirmation of everything he'd been warning about vis-a-vis the devil's assaults on the community in the last days.
I pray God that the evil has been banished from the children.
This thing is not done. They are 3, yet we know the devil hides among us 9.
There are 9. There's a man in black. There's a book. This confirms what a lot of people feel. This is the moment where everything changes. It is not anymore about a few unpopular women who people have always been suspicious about. It's a conspiracy.
Still to come on Witches of Salem.
Fear can be a very contagious phenomenon.
This moves from the hand of Satan upon the Parris household to the hand of Satan upon all of Salem Village.
The girls just went wild.
I am not a witch!
It became apparent that if you confessed to witchcraft, that they would keep you alive, at least for a while.
It's the most extraordinary event.
The visions of the black masses are so clearly the reverse of a regular service.
It sends shockwaves through the Salem community.
The anticipation would have been so thick you could have cut it with a knife.
Offer this witch for your judgment.
It's chilling to think about watching someone you know hanged to death and feeling good.
The whole godly kingdom is in deadly peril.